Ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword has one of the best new Ash of Wars in White Light Charge that zooms you forward and can do a massive explosion with great damage and easy stance break potential. Here's my build for this super fun new Colossal sword. Let's go! So the Ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword, now before we go into some details, it bothers me so much that in Elden Ring there's so many weapons that have like the name of another category in their title, right? This is titled the Ancient Meteoric Greatsword, but it's actually a Colossal sword. The same thing is true for the actual Greatsword, which is a Colossal sword. It's not a Greatsword, which is its own category. So just, you know, minor pet peeve aside. This weapon is great. The White Light Charge is what really stands out here as its Ash of War. You have a massive like gap closing ability that then does like this white light explosion if you trigger the effect again. What's really interesting about this weapon not only is that it does magic damage, but it doesn't scale with intelligence. It primarily scales with strength, very closely followed by arcane, and it also doesn't have any blood loss buildup, which is really interesting for a weapon like this. And it's one of the best parts about the DLC is getting these weird hybrid weapons and really unique in this way. Like this is an incredible Colossal sword in its own right, because Colossal swords are fantastic for all of that poise damage to like stance break, follow up with critical hits and stuff, but you've actually got quite a fast gap closing ability with the Ash of War here, and then you can trigger that effect again to deal a solid amount of damage with that white explosion effect. So you get the benefits of having a massive colossal weapon from like all of that, like, you know, stance break stuff as well, but then you get a relatively fast Ash of War that also does a really solid attack as well. And then it's got that unique scaling of focusing on strength and arcane, but also doing magic damage, which is really unique. So let's talk about where you can get it from. And you can get it from the Ruined Forge Starfall Pass, which is sort of to the east, southish east a little bit of Castle Ensis. Now, technically, you need to get through Castle Ensis to like get here. So you'll need to have beaten the final boss of Castle Ensis, but you can get here through Fort Reprimand without actually having to beat Castle Ensis. So if you start from the Castlefront ruins and take the path to where the road forks, and then follow the cliff face down into like the poisonous swamp area, then follow that path all the way up. Just before the Elder's Hovel, you will actually see a Spirit Spring, which is locked. You can then unlock that Spirit Spring, use it to jump up, which will take you behind the Fort of Reprimand, which takes you up into that next area of the map after Castle Ensis, and then you can just like follow the path all the way to the Ruined Forge of Starfall Pass. Equipment for this build, we're obviously using this Greatsword. I'm using a Golden Vow Dagger for the attack and defensive buffs. I've also got the Sacrificial Axe in my offhand for the FP regen here. Now, it's just an empty slot, right? I am actually two-handing this weapon, but because the axe is technically equipped, anytime you defeat an enemy, you'll get that little bit of FP regen from the Sacrificial Axe. Whatever armor you want to wear here, like I'm wearing the Knight set with the Solitude set just because it looks fresh. I covered where you can get both of these in my recent armor video, which I'll link here for you guys. And talisman-wise, I'm using the Dragon Crest Great Shield, the two-handed talisman for the extra damage while two-handing, because we are two-handing right now. This doesn't affect your weapon skills, only your normal attacks, right? So just any of your light, heavy attacks, jump attacks, all that stuff. The Shard of Alexander for the weapon skill damage is obviously fantastic here. And then the last slot is a little situational. I would suggest you to mix and match depending on the situation. I do like the Blade of Mercy here to buff your attack power after critical hits, because you will get plenty of those. The Crusade Insignia as well to buff your attack power after defeating enemies is good when you're just like out exploring and defeating enemies. The Magic Scorpion Charm isn't bad as well to raise your magic damage of this weapon. The Claw Talisman enhances your jump attacks, which, you know, is also good for this build to like slam down that massive greatsword onto enemies. Or even the two-headed Turtle Talisman I've actually used for certain encounters as well, because you do chunk up a lot of that stamina with this weapon. So getting some of that stamina recovery back is also fantastic as well. And I did cover where you can get all of these new talismans in my recent talisman video as well, which I'll also link here. For attributes, I'm running 50 Vigor, 30 Mind, and 50 Endurance. You do want to wear some of the heavier armor and have that extra stamina for this build, because it is not only a heavy weapon in its own right, but because you're going to exclusively be in melee range, you do want that resistances and the poise from some of those heavier armors. Now, obviously, you want to make sure you're above that 51 breakpoint for poise, but you will want to wear one of the heavier armors anyway. Strength-wise, we're at 65, and I'm sitting at about 50 arcane. I did tinker a little bit with these. It does seem that it scales slightly better with strength, at least to that 65 mark, and then arcane it does scale really well with as well. It's just that, you know, being level 200, I ran out of points to put these up any higher, but you sort of will want to have your stats to be roughly similar to mine that I have here in this build. For some tips for playing this build, we'll start with buffs. I'm using Radahn's Great Rune for the FP, HP, and stamina. The Golden Vow Dagger is also a fantastic buff here, and you could also use the new Sacred Bloody Flesh that you can get throughout the DLC that buffs your physical attack power and your arcane. It does buff further if you do see blood loss build up, which we don't in this build, but you could also use the, you know, the old classic buffs there as well if you wanted to look for some buffs in that category as well. Now, what's interesting about like this as a gap closing and just the general gameplay of this build is because the Ash of War does like zoom you into enemies, right? You get that gap closing effect. You can sort of hang back a little bit and dodge a lot of those longer combos that you see in the DLC, as well as those like heavy hitting attacks from like the base game, and then zoom yourself in. You get that initial hit with the stab and then blow that up to like follow up with like really good damage. I find that the poise damage on the Ash of War isn't as good as, say, just using like your jump attacks or your heavy attacks or something like that. So just be mindful of that if that's what you're aiming for, then maybe to lean into those a little bit more, as it doesn't appear to do as much as them. But just the overall damage on the gap closer and then the explosion, especially the explosion, is really solid to just like lean into. And if you can trigger these very quickly on bosses, like even just regular enemies, you will definitely break their stance very quickly. And because of the stagger potential of this being such a large weapon as well, you can very easily stagger enemies out of their typical attack animations, which is something you really want to do. And that's also really beneficial for the DLC as well, because you do have so many enemies in the DLC that just have massive long attack like chain combinations, and if you can knock them out of that before they've even started the chain, or you know, they get their big heavy hitting attacks off, it's really beneficial. And that's something I've noticed a lot with using this build and even other builds that I've been making throughout the DLC, right? Is that enemies have massive long combos, and for some reason anytime you enter any boss arena they stab you in the face, but they're really like a bit more aggressive, I think, in the DLC. So being able to challenge that aggression with a high like impact weapon like this, plus solid damage negation, which even in your physique flask, right, you can put in that tier that helps with your damage negation as well, so that you've got that extra benefit. So you can tank some hits with this build, which you definitely like can trade off. You could also drop like the sacrificial axe, right, if you don't have the equip load to have that equipped, or like the golden vow dagger, right, for that defense and that sort of thing. But I've got them equipped mostly just for like a bit of flavor to add some juice to this build. But if you don't want to use that route, you just want to use the greatsword, or you could even add like a bow or something like that to this build if I was thinking about things to add to give you some range potential as well, because this is mostly like a melee focused build. But I didn't feel that I needed that as much because of the damage you can get from the Ash of War on its own, but also like the gap closing aspect of it. Often that, you know, in a lot of builds that you feel personally that I feel I need a ranged option, it's a bit more of a finesse build, whereas this is just like literally charging in with a big stick and bonking enemies on the face with it. So I didn't feel it as necessary, but you can definitely add like a bow or something like that if you wanted to for this build. But let me know your thoughts on this build and any other builds in the comments down below. What would you change in this build? What would you add? I'd love to know in the comments. But thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.